Shanawaz. I lead the data and analytics practice for Accuvate. I have been in the industry for close to 20 odd years, building data warehouses, data lake solutions in various domains, including CPG, BFSI, etc. So today I'll be going through, say, the current challenges with the data architecture, what we have today. How is data mesh trying to build people, process, and technology together to be able to address the current challenges with the existing data architecture, and then finish it up with touching upon how we can leverage Azure for implementing a data mesh, right? So in today's world, there is an assumption that a monolithic structure would work for data as well, right? So we have all of these data sources in enterprises, in small and medium companies, and then we have consumers who would want to, say, build their own machine learning models or build their own reporting on top of it, right? And then how do we go from here to there, right? So today, it's all like wizards where IT teams build a centralized repository where we bring in data from everywhere, have it aggregated, and then move it to the consumers, right? Is this a bad architecture? No, so far, no. In the recent 2-3 years, what we have seen is the business users themselves want to build their own reports, build their own ML models, right? So there are a lot of challenges around it, which we will see in a minute, right? So this is what happens today, right? So you have your transactional systems, then you have your analytical systems, and then there is a centralized architecture which does all of this, cleaning, curating the data. The IT owns majority of it. So I was talking to one of the customers, right? So they do have a data warehouse built on Oracle, sitting on-prem, right? So they consume all of the data from the data warehouse because it is mandated by the enterprise as well as by the IT team, which is a centralized IT team, right? So what they do, they use Excel as their go-to source for getting all of this data. Either they write macros to directly connect to the transactional database to pull the data, or connect sometimes to the data warehouse. Some of the IT teams allow that, right? Or they have, say, other reporting tools which uses, say, tabular reporting. At the end of the day, I download it into Excel, and then as a business, I have my own IT team, right, who builds reporting for me. This was a financial customer, right? So they have to do financial projections. So financial projections are very important. For that, they build statistical models, right? So there is a separate IT team within the business which understands what the business wants. They interact with them on a day-to-day basis. They have their own Oracle database. There is an Oracle data warehouse from where they get all of the data, push it into an Oracle database for the reporting, and then they create these reports, right? So what is the issue with this kind of architecture, right? One, who is going to be the owner for this data, right? Is it the transactional systems which create the data? Or is it the centralized IT team which, say, curates the data, aggregates the data, and then pushes it to the analytics consumers? Or Is it going to be the siloed reporting team which is sitting along with the business, which understands business, right? Who is owning the data? Lack of data ownership is one of the biggest challenges, right? If everything goes smooth, which does not happen all the time, right? If things go wrong, when this question comes, the blame game starts, right? Saying the centralized IT team would start pointing fingers at the data source, right? They are giving us this data. And the transactional source systems would say, boss, we do not know what you are doing with the data we push in, right? You write your own business logic, you're aggregating it, etc. Right? At the end of the day, the business do not get the right type of insights what they want, right? So there is a disconnect between what the business wants, what the IT team provides, and the central team kind of becomes a bottleneck, right? So today the business users would want to have their reports when they need it, but they don't get it on time, right? So because of that, they are not able to take decisions when they have to do it, right? So I ask for a report, the IT team gives me the report after 2 weeks. Now that's no longer a requirement for me, right? So that ship has already sailed. So how do we solve it, right? Then, of course, as we build it as a centralized architecture, there is a lot of technical depth which keeps adding over a period of time, right? So how do we resolve this? This also comes because of the lack of ownership. And we have also seen there are places where there is a lot of dark data today, right? So everyone today agrees that data is critical for running any enterprise, right? So let's say I'm a scientist who wants to find or build an ML model, right? So how do I go about finding where the data source is? I might know what I want, but I would not know where to go look for it, right? So these are some of the challenges which we see with respect to the centralized IT team or centralized data warehousing what we have today, right? So for the last 2 years, there is this concept of data mesh, which tries to address some of the challenges. As I said, it's trying to bring people. There is a process, and then the technology would evolve over a period of time, which would be able to create like composable data architecture, which would be able to address these pain points, kind of say who the owner for the data is, and it resides on the principle of, say, breaking up the data ownership, right? So now we would have data providers, right? So the data providers would ensure that the data goes out as a data product, right? So what I mean by data product is it is like a product which is given in our hands, and then we would be able to play around with it. It's a usable product, right? So the data owner would ensure that the data product is usable. It has the data quality issues addressed, etc. And then there would be a data consumer who would also have ownership in terms of how the data is getting transformed for their consumption, right? At some point of time, the data consumer could also be a data provider who would create a data product for the consumption, right? So that's what is creating this mesh, right? So you have data providers who create data products, then there are data consumers who create transformations as they want, as they need it, and then they again become your data providers, right? So it becomes all tangled together, and then it creates a data mesh, right? So there is no centralized team. In this case, who's the owner? Whoever is managing the data becomes the data owner, right? So they have the responsibility to ensure the data is clean, the data is usable, and it addresses any of the technical challenges in terms of consumption of the data. Data mesh is based on these four principles, right? One, it is domain-oriented, right? So what I mean by domain here is, let's say I'm a CPG company, right? So I would have different functions. I would have HR, I would have IT, I would have supply chain, right? So there is a certain boundary in which I would operate on my data, right? So HR team has its own HR systems. IT team has their own IT systems. So they understand the data. The data creators understand the data, and they also know how the data would be used, right? Not always, though the consumers might be different. To some extent, a HR person or a HR IT team would understand their data a lot better than, say, a centralized IT team who's managing HR data, right? So the domain is kind of decentralized across all these functions, and we would have a centralized governance, right? I would come to that in a minute. I talked about data as a product, right? So here we treat the data to be stable. It should be technically feasible so that I could have multiple systems reading the data concurrently. So it has to be read optimized. And of course, the domain-specific transformations would have to be applied before it gets pushed to the data consumers, right? Then the third aspect is it has to be self-service, right? So when I say self-service, it's not about just building your own reports or building, I mean, the business building their own reports or machine learning models, right? It's about, say, I want to create my own data as a product. I should have the ability to request for the necessary resources when I want it, and then have my data product built, right? Let's say I'm a marketing team, and I would want to understand how my product is being used, right? So for that, I might have to pull information from my supply chain, from internal, external sources, etc., right? So I pull all of this information, and then I should be able to, say, spin up servers, spin up, say, a Synapse layer or a database layer, or create my own pipelines, and be able to build, say, self-service reporting and ML models on top of it, right? So these are kind of decentralized, right? And then the last aspect is, with self-service comes a lot of problems, right? So how do I govern who has what kind of access? So we are talking about self-service for infrastructure, right? In that case, anyone can spin any infrastructure what they want. No, that should not be the way how it is done. It has to be a very well-governed mechanism, without which decentralizing would not be a possibility, right? So we should be able to define who has what kind of access, what kind of data access should be there, and also define for that enterprise what kind of topology. So there are various topologies with which a data mesh can be created, right? So what kind of topology the enterprise is going to take up should also be defined using a federated computational governance principle. right? Getting into the details of this, right? Let's say that there is a CPG company, right? So a CPG company would have multiple functions, or in this case, these are the domains which I'm talking about, right? So there could be, say, customer services management, HR management, IT management, and then supply chain. Supply chain itself is today a cross-functional supply chain tower, which brings in data from various functions within the company, right? So with these domains in place, how do I say make each of these domains their own owners for the data, right? Again, this can be done based on the 4 basic principles what we discussed, right? So we saw about the 4 functions of the CPG company, right? So you have customer services management in blue, HR in green, IT management in bluish, supply chain in brown, right? Each of that becomes the domain, right? So there is a centralized governance. People who are familiar with Purview would know that it is possible to do data governance with Purview, and this would cut across all of these domains, right? And with this, I should be able to leverage different patterns for, we have both, say, batch analytics as well as IoT or streaming analytics, right? So I should be able to create a Lambda architecture and then expose it to the end users for building their own digital twins or building their own reports or ML models, right? So each of these domains would be responsible for creating their own data as a product and exposing it to the other third parties, right, who are ready to consume the data and then build their own data platform. So the core to this is still these 4 principles where it is domain specific today. The domain owners would be owning the data. They would be providing the data as a product, right? And there are automated services today available on Azure which can help with, say, automated provisioning of your data management zone, of your data landing zone, right? So all of that can be standardized, and with the help of, say, Terraforms or ARM templates, someone could request the kind of resources they want for creating a data product, and then that can be spin off in in minutes, right? It could take about 15 to 20 minutes for spinning up all of these services in an automated way. And then the other fundamental block, which has enabled this decentralized approach is, or the domain ownership approach is, today we have these massive data lakes, right? I know enterprises which kind of have data lakes created, which gets all of the data in its raw format, feeding into the data lake, and then that data gets transformed into like a business layer where it is processed and then further pushed into the business layer, all right? And then you have your own data consumers who pick up on the data from the business data lake and then create their own data products, right? So for all of this, it is the data lake as well as the analytics data engine like Synapse becomes key, right? So what does a data product today look like? So we have a data collection, data sources that gets pushed into, say, a storage, and then I have my compute against it for doing all of the transformation, orchestration probably done by Azure Data Factory, and then push it to get insights, right? So a typical data product, if you go back to the functions, say, customer management or HR management or IT management, would create a data product like this. The technical implementation of this could be something like this, right? So I have my operational systems, which pushes the data into my data lake. So there is a raw zone where the data lands. It gets enriched, it gets curated to be consumed, right? So all of this can be done with a serverless Synapse architecture where I have my Apache Spark pool or Synapse pipeline to have it converted into a data product which can be used by the consumers, right? And the critical aspect for governance is having a metadata store, right? So you would create like glossaries, you would create a data catalog using a metadata framework, like a meta store, right? Which can be used by Purview to be able to identify what data is available within the enterprise to be able to build your reports or ML models, right? And then observability becomes a key for governance because we are talking about self-service infrastructure, right? So how do I ensure that everything is going smooth, right? So people are spinning up their own clusters, their own Synapse layer, their own pipelines, right? How do I ensure that all of this is running smooth? So for that, we'll have to have a logging framework, which is robust enough to be able to push the observability data and then flag off if there are any issues, right? And of course, for the data security, classification of data forms a key part, right? Purview has the ability to classify your private and confidential information, right? It could say identify which are your email IDs. It could identify your credit card, the columns which have credit card information, and then you could have your own policies applied for each of these data elements. How do you want to handle it, right? And now I have a data catalog, right? So me as a, say, a data scientist, I'm able to go into Purview, be able to search for a particular data set. It shows me all the list of, say, the data stores which have that particular information, right? And from within Purview, you would also be able to request access. We would define who the data owner is, and then it triggers an access request to the data owner. Once the data owner approves, I would have access to that data source. So we could create these workflows within Purview today. Right. Now, would there be only one data product in an enterprise? No. Each of the functions what we saw would have their own data product, right? So the consumer management team could create their own data product which would push data into some data lake. IT management would have its own data product which could push data into data lake. Or there could be multiple data products within a function or within a domain as well to be able to push data to the data consumers, right? So how does this evolve, right? So this evolves as, say, individual resource groups with a different kind of infrastructure, right? So each of this resource group, consider it as a data product, right, which has all of the components which we just saw, right? So there could be one resource group per domain, or there could be multiple resource groups per domain which are talking through a private endpoint, right? So for an enterprise to work, it is crucial that all of these resource groups come together and then work together, right? Because an enterprise would need data from multiple sources. What we have defined is now it is self-service. I should be able to create my own data product. The domain is responsible for creating good quality data products and then exposing it to the data consumers, right? And all of this can be built within Azure. Azure provides the necessary tools for self-service infrastructure, for self-service reporting, for self-service machine learning, and stuff, right? So this comes together like the four wheels of a car, right? It's all conceptual if you look at it. So each of it is its own data product, living in its silos. It starts working together when all of this is brought together, right? I will skip this one. Okay, I just had a Tamil song which says Paravaigal Palavidam, right? So the topologies what we have today, it's not going to be the same, right? Every enterprise would have its own topology for creating a data mesh, and it has to be architected by your enterprise architecture team based on the needs, right? So the needs would be what is the unique data which the enterprise has, who is going to be responsible for that ownership of the data, right? Not all enterprises go through change at the same pace, right? Let's say if you are a startup, your pace of change within the organization would be very rapid, whereas if it's a big billion-dollar enterprise, the pace of change would be different, right? So that plays a crucial role. And so whoever is an enterprise architect would have to have all of this in mind to be able to define a topology that would take you further for years, right? A highly federated mesh, this is like I have all my domains, and each of the domain talks to each of the domain, right? If you think of implementing this, right? So I have my HR product, I have my IT product, I have my supply chain product, right? So each of it would have its own infrastructure resources. To be simple, right? Let's say there is a HR product which has, say, an Azure data lake, data factory, Databricks, and then you have Synapse, as well as Power BI and machine learning, right? So this has these many components, and each of it would have all these components. And say if it's a large enterprise, connecting each of these components with private endpoints, that's going to take a lot of time to be able to build like a harmonized data mesh, right? This is essential, and this would work out for a large enterprise who would want to bring in domain by domain, right? A little toned down approach is the fine-grained and fully governed mesh. This is what I have seen to be working for some of the enterprise customers, right? This is what I was describing as well. So you have your HR domain, you have your IT domain, etc. And then each of the domain pushes the data to a business layer, right? So from that business layer, they consume it. So whoever is the data consumer, they pick it up, and then they consume the data from that business data lake, right? This is something which most of the enterprises have started adopting, and it gives them the flexibility, right? So people who are familiar with the data vault concept, the evolved Kimball methodology, right? They would understand that approach was quite similar to this, where you would be able to say build it as and when it's needed in an automated way, right? And then there are other different kinds of meshes, which is hybrid of and harmonized mesh and a finely grained mesh. So that's the hybrid federated mesh, right? So each of this has its own advantages and disadvantages. So it's for the enterprise architect to kind of think through what that enterprise needs and be able to build on something, right? And if we take one of these parts, we could go from an easier point to a difficult point, right? So I could start off with a fine-grained, fully governed mesh, right? As we evolve, we might think that each of these domains might also would have to talk to each other, right? So if that becomes implicit, then we can move towards a highly harmonized data mesh. Right. So this is the common practice which I'm talking about, right? So each of it is a data product which has both a local storage as well as a shared storage, right? That shared storage could be your raw layer, or it could be your transformed business layer. And from here, you would have consumers picking up the data, doing their own processing, and then pushing it for analytics or building ML models. Right? Now, how do I implement this in Azure? Right? So Azure gives you, today for cloud scale analytics, it gives you the option for creating data management landing zones and then data landing zone, right? Data management landing zone is for your governance purpose. So you have your Purview, you have your key vault, you have your data share, which all forms part of the data management zone, right? And then you have your data domains. So this is your data product, right? So each of this is your data product, which shares data across the domains, right? A data product could be, say, doing only batch processing or streaming analytics, or it could be a mix of, say, batch and streaming, which is more like a Lambda or a Kappa architecture, what you see today, right? So that one is more blown up of what this does today, right? So you have your data domains, which creates data product, and then you have the central governance mechanism, which is taken care by Purview for creating data lake, understanding data lineage, and whatnot. And all of the data is, of course, we know it's secure within Azure. Even the credentials, when we use Key Vault, it's going to be secure, right? So we have the data management landing zone, and then we have the data landing zone, right? So the data management landing zone takes care of creating your private networks. If you have to bring data from your on-prem sources to Azure, it takes care of the firewall needed, the network. It takes care of your credentials for connecting to these data sources. Purview takes care of your governance. And of course, the crucial aspect of this is having observability, since it's going to be self-service infrastructure, right? So Azure Monitor plays that role of creating an observable platform for you across the enterprise, right? And you would use, let's say if you have to share the data, you would use Azure Data Share to share the data. Then this connects to the landing zone. Landing zone is where you would have all of the domain-specific transformations applied, right? So I would have a landing zone for, say, HR, for IT, for sales, for marketing, for supply chain, right? So you would have your data transformed as you need. So click of a button, I would be able to say create a data management landing zone, and then another click of a button, I would be able to create a data landing zone as per the needs. And of course, that could be tweaked further based on the needs of the enterprise, right? So putting all of this in place, right? So the data mesh principle talks about the federated governance. You have different planes for analytical data. You would have planes for the multipurpose components, right? So this translates into the Azure technical landscape, which we have been talking so far, right? So you have your governance layer, which is with, say, Purview, the core services where you define all of your policies, etc. And then you have your data products. Your data products could be batch or streaming. And then you have your platform as a service, infrastructure as a service layer, right? So that gets translated. So you have your infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service layer on top of it. So that takes me back to the car analogy with data products being the wheel and the different components, right? So my end user or the business user would not have to worry about how the car runs, right? All they have to do is just get in, hold the steering, do what they want, right? So there is no dependency on the centralized IT team, right? Because everyone owns their own data. Everyone is responsible for creating data products which would be used by the business users as they want, right? So that all of that translates into a self-service platform, which is the ask of today. And this is going to happen more with more tech-savvy folks becoming business leaders, right? So today we see any head of HR or head of supply chain management, they are very tech-savvy and they would want to do things. They are familiar with machine learning models, so they would want to build their own machine learning models, and all they ask is the data in a curated format so they could quickly connect and be able to consume it, right? So data mesh is something which is evolving, and it should be able to cater to the needs of the business leaders of tomorrow, right? Are we there yet? Again, sorry, the audio isn't working. Are we there yet in terms of data mesh, right? We do have the process in place. We do have people talking about data mesh. The more we talk about it, it would evolve, right? Technology, we do have the technology on Azure for implementing all of these pieces, but there is certainly work that needs to be done, which could happen through interactions through these communities, right? Where, let's say, I was talking to a customer who wanted to implement something similar. It's a manufacturing company which has factories spread across the globe, right? So we were talking about having each of the factory own its own data, right? They were all excited about it, right? And then we said, let's implement on Azure, right? Then they started thinking about how would we manage the cost? How would we move data from one region to another region, right? So these are things which are still evolving. The business likes the idea of owning their own data and then allows this self-service reporting, right? But the technology would have to evolve and then take us to the North Pole Star, right? Data mesh is going to be the pole star where we are all gravitated towards. And if the question is, are we there yet? We are getting there, and probably in the next couple of years, we would have the technology streamlined, which we should be able to move towards, right? So that's all. Thank you for giving me this opportunity.